Okay, excuse me, we start this video on page 353, stage 1, working with CSS grids. We've already spent some time with Bootstrap, and we understand the concept of what's called responsive design. This project's going to introduce another method of accomplishing the same goal, but without the underlying framework that is required for our Bootstrap pages to function. As the name implies, CSS grids rely on CSS to define the flexible grids and rows and columns. You have to use media queries to change the grid's base to the user's display size, and we'll learn some basic steps on how to do all of that. The CSS grid involves an underlying column grid, just the same way as set up with Bootstrap. One significant difference between the two is CSS grids keep the grid definitions entirely separate from HTML, where Bootstrap, you use classes in HTML to define the element size and position in the grid. Okay, so that is the basic difference between the two, and if you spend some time reviewing page 353, it will show you the exact difference between the two, and I highly recommend that you take a look at both of that. And also notice how on the CSS one, it does have an app media minimum width 992 pixels, which means this particular one was set up for a desktop. But anyway, that's how it works. And so let's get started. The first thing, of course, that we are going to need to do is to go to Files. Okay, we've got to go to Manage Sites. Okay, you're going to have to go New Site. I'm going to call mine Project 1. You call yours no, let's just do it right. Call it Melon. Okay, and then go search and find your folder. And I'm going to recommend again to put it on the desktop, please. For the reason being is that way you have, and especially with this particular project we're doing, because it's quite easy to mess it up. So you want to make sure you leave your original files alone, so you have them to pull out again if necessary. So once you have typed Melon and you've pointed to your file folder, let's click Save and Done, and of course we'll bring everything open over here on the right hand side. Okay, and let's open our index.html. Okay. And activate split view and make sure live view is on. And in the code panel, let's go into the source code. Okay. We created this file with all the content that was required to complete the project. You already know how to place HTML content in the page, and it talks about grid styles. And at the beginning of line 18, you will notice the div class header has just one thing in it, and that's the header to the page to satisfy your sense of adventure. It can be opened and closed with the arrow. Let's go ahead and close it. And we'll continue on with the next exercise. The next exercise, starting on page 356, talks about designing and defining a CSS grid container. And as the introduction video that I gave you, I explained the differences of why you don't want to use a 3-column one, and it would be ideal to use at least a minimum of a 6-column one, and I also recommend not doing one over 12 columns no matter what. Anyway, with the index HTML open, let's click the grid style CSS, and I've already got this typed in. But what you're going to do is you're going to start at the very top up here to create a new class section called grid wrap, and we're going to put in display grid, max width, margin, and that's all 4 margins. Okay, so go ahead and type those all in. And once you have finished typing all of those in, I want you to notice the next line is grid template columns with the repeat 6, 1 FR. And what those are is those are ways to define the number and size of columns in a grid. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4. And I discussed this again in the introduction template. And in this case, it's a repeat 6 with 1 FR, which stands for fraction, which means they're all going to be the same size. So they're going to repeat it 6 times, so it's 6 columns. And then they did the same thing with rows, but gave them a min-max. Okay, but anyway, so type in the grid dash template repeat 6 and then comma space 1 FR and then close it with the semicolon. The next line is template dash or grid dash template dash rows. Okay, and what you're going to do is you are going to repeat 7 times, which means 7 rows. Okay, and you're going to give them a minimum maximum. Okay, the minimum is 20 pixels, which defines the number and size of the rows. Okay, and the auto portion is saying that they will be automatically spaced. After you have done that and you've done the grid auto rows and read about implicit rows in that section, okay, and it's 7 explicit rows, which means we're going to have definitely 7 defined rows. And then step number 7 is add the following line to the grid wrap selector. Okay, the grid wrap, which is a grid gap. Okay, that gives you space between the grid items. So it's like building a margin around the rows and the columns. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give it a grid gap of 10 pixels. So go ahead and type that in as well, which is the last thing of it. And then you're going to do a Control S to save your work. Now our next portion of this is on page 359. Define the size and the position of the CSS grid items. And why this is important is this allows me to plant items to where they don't jump and move. One of the biggest problems we had once we started doing CSS was after placing items and using the float properties and stuff, what would happen is the items would jump depending on the size of the page, and it became a real problem. And up until this particular version of Dreamweaver, I have not seen this before. Okay, so 2 years ago, I do not believe this was available. I could be wrong, but any of the books I had back then did not describe any of this at all. Now, the most important feature when we start doing these is I want you to notice closely these grid rows and grid column areas, and notice they all have spaces in between each one of these items. So you're going to have to make sure that when you type these in here that you be sure to put a space after the colon and between each of the numbers and each of the right slashes. Okay, the only place that does not have a space is when you end the rule. That's the only place that there is no additional space. Now, how this works in a grid row, okay, this one is starting with the first grid row and ending with the second grid row. So it's opening and closing. And same thing with columns. This is starting with the first column and ending with the 7th. Even though there's only 6 columns, there's still 7 lines. Remember what I told you about needing an extra line in the last row and in the last column. So this is 6 columns, not 7. And this is row 1 and row 2. Okay, and then the same thing with the header. Okay, we're going to open it on the second row, and the span is a value that defines how many rows or columns an item should occupy. So when they say span 1, it means it's going to span just one row, okay? And then if it says more than that, like the grid column where it says span 6, okay, this means, okay, we're going to start with the first column and we're going to go all the way through all 6. So that's another way of writing it to save you from having to write like what we did up here in the underneath logo. So let's go ahead and type in the header one and the video one. The video one, we're going to start on row 3 and we're only going to span one row. Okay, but what we're going to do is we're going, for the column, we're going to start with the first column and we're going to span all 6 for the video. So let's go ahead and get those typed in again, remembering the spaces, but no spaces just before the semicolon. So let's go ahead and put those in. Then we're going to add 3 new class selectors in the grid style CSS. We're going to do them for the 3 text boxes, and that's the 3 that you see next. And you will notice that there are 4 numbers on these. And again, if you watch the first introduction video, we talked about this, where we can sort of do a shorthand, so to speak, where we have the grid row start, and then we have the column row start, and then we have the grid row end, and then we have the column end. And that's why we're seeing those 4 numbers, and that's what those 4 numbers represent. And this is what we're doing here, is we're telling the text boxes exactly where they need to be placed. Okay, for instance, this one is starting in row 4 and the 3rd column over, and it is going to stop in row 5, and it's going to go from column 3 through column 6. Okay, and so on and so forth for text 1, text 2, text 3. So at this point, let's go ahead and get those in. And you can pause to go ahead and type those in. And then once you're done typing them in, hit unpause, and we'll talk a minute about the image ones. Okay, now there's going to be 4 new class selectors that you're going to put in for the image ones. And again, they're using 3 for the image and 1 for the footer. Okay, and the image ones, of course, are going to still be built on the same principles that we use for the text ones, starting the first image one starts in row 4, first column, ends in row 5, and it's going to stop at the 3rd column, and then so on and so forth for the other 2. The very last one is for the footer. And what it's going to do is it's going to start in row 7, and it's going to start with column 1, and it's going to end in row 8, and it's going to span all 6 columns. Okay, so you can go ahead and get those put in. And once you have put all of those in, let's do a Control S and save your work.